Hello, welcome. My name is Arsen Sorobin from Dance Channel TV, and thanks for tuning in. Today I have a very special guest, is Terry Hyde, who is a psychotherapist, and he's a counselor and founder of Counselling for Dance. We decided to interview him because it's a very touchy subject, psychology in dance and what the dancers actually go through to become a professional dancers. So him being as dancer and now getting into psychotherapy would be very interesting to find out and understand what is dance is all about. So Terry, tell us a little bit about how you got yourself into psychotherapy and a little bit about your background.
I started dancing when I was 6 years old, when my mother sent me to ballet class because I kept jumping on the furniture and she wanted to not have to buy new furniture all the time. So she would spend out on dancing classes. At age 10, I won a 5-year scholarship to the RAD, the Royal Academy of Dance, in London. And then when I was 16, I joined the Royal Ballet Senior School, again in London. After which I went into the Royal Ballet. And after a few years, 2.5 years, I think it was, I joined London's Festival Ballet as a soloist. London's Festival Ballet is now called English National Ballet. I wanted to do more, so after about 3 years, I did an audition for a UK tour of West Side Story. This is back in the early 70s, by the way. 1970s, not 1870s. And I did that 3-month tour. It was incredible, the best show that I've ever done. After which I went into West End, which is the equivalent of your Broadway, West End musicals, film and television. Even performing with Barbra Streisand in a TV special that she recorded over here in the UK.
Wonderful.
So having retired at the ripe old age of 29 from performing, I set up a business management organization looking after people in show business, as their business manager. I set up and run that for 15 years. During that time, the clients would have meetings with me, or I would go to see them, and they would tend to offload all their issues. So not only their financial or whatever I was dealing with at the time, or their work, but their personal things. I had no idea what to do with this information that they were pouring out on me. So when I sold the business management organization 15 years later, I trained to be a psychotherapist. So there was quite a transition going from performing into business and then into psychotherapy. But it wasn't until 2016 when a retired dancer who had just been discharged from a psychiatric unit came to see me for therapy. I saw her for 6 months, I think it was, and then discharged her. Excuse me, I'm going to clear my throat. And then when I discharged her, I thought, this is unique. I've been there, done that, and now I'm doing the psychotherapy. So I put them two together and set up a website called counsellingfordancers.com. But it wasn't until that was set up that I started banging on doors, and the doors were, unfortunately, a lot of them were closed. People wouldn't listen because they didn't want to talk about mental health. So this was artistic directors, principals of vocational schools. They just didn't want to talk about it. They would tick boxes to make sure that they cover their backs. But all it is a glamour thing, on stage performance, brilliant school. Look where our students have gone, where they're performing now, but not what's happening to the students and not what's happening to the dancers in the professional companies where everything is hidden. They'll talk about their physical injuries and things like that, but nothing to do with emotions. So it's taken 2 years to be able to get recognition of, yes, we need you to come along to our school to do your proactive mental health workshops. And so that is what I'm doing at the moment, building up my name around the world, in fact, because last November I was at the Joffrey Ballet School in New York City. Spent 2 days there doing the workshops and seeing the students one-to-one, those that wanted to come to see me. And because I also do therapy via internet link as well. So, dancers all around the world can have therapy with me. But the main push that I'm doing at the moment is trying to get either summer intensives, Easter intensives, pre-professional schools and colleges and dance companies to have my workshops.
Now, you kind of found a lot of demand that dancers actually need that, and that's why you create that organization, right?
Yes, that's right. The dancers have come to me because I've got an Instagram account, Counselling for Dancers. Oh, by the way, because you have an American audience, presumably, counselling in the UK is spelt with 2 L's.
Okay, good.
Okay, so when they do searches,
Wonderful.
they need to do that. I just thought I'd mention that as a little aside. They're saying to me, why can't our school do it? So I contact the school and they say, oh, no, we've got a psychologist. And of course, that's a performance psychologist or a sports psychologist. They don't deal with mental health. So it's quite sort of on the surface. Performance anxiety and things like that can be cleared up by the performance psychologist. But it's the triggers, the underlying factors going back into childhood, which is what I work on, so that they don't get the trigger about being nervous to go on stage, about throwing up after a performance, all of those sort of things.
Okay. Well, from my own experience as well too, as a dancer and now educator, I have realized that there are a lot of people who want to be a professional dancer. Now, despite the fact that there's a very difficult to achieve, what do you think people choose to this career as a way of life because there's so much difficulty to achieve and then no financial really support or gratitude?
Okay, well, I think if we just take the dancing, whether ballet, contemporary, whether Irish dancing, it's something within us, and I'm sure you understand, Arson. There is something within us when we start ballet that pushes us, that drives us, because we love the music, the dance, putting them all together, the movement, everything like that, and that spirit within us drives us forward. But that spirit that within us that drives us forward can also be detrimental because it pushes us too far. Our body can't take it, and that's where burnout comes in. So there's the determination that's wired into our brain. There's the focus. All of those positive things then become not an asset anymore, but become detrimental. They become a liability and we start burning out. So I think if there's a measured approach to understanding how dancers work, how dancers' minds work, then that will be accomplishing a much more longer career than just sort of rushing in and saying, you need to do this, you need to jump there, you need to do temperettes, you need to do triple tours, you need to be able to do this, that. You need to be able to get your foot up around your back of your neck. All of these sort of things that you see on Instagram and think, why are they doing this? They just need to have a measured pace. And I think it's pushed too far too quickly. You see a lot of young tennis players going out on the circuit having burnout at 15, 16.
Yeah, I mean, right now, even if you look at the ballet, the way it was 10, 20 years ago, it really kind of like progressed so much. And I think maybe, excuse me, everything becomes more accessible, in terms of competition. So how do you look at the kids start competing? I mean, how much psychologically, emotionally kids have to be ready to go there, and plus sometimes parents getting involved too much and pushing kids to go there.
Quite right. There's 2 aspects there. I mean, when I was performing back in the between the mid 60s to late 1970s, there were no competitions. There were the 2, Adelaide Jenny and another competition. I can't remember what it was. But I think the competitions have come from America. from the US, and because everyone likes to be a winner. And so there is so much pressure, as you said, from an early age to be a winner. You see, and if you're not a winner, what are you? A loser. And when we start ballet at an early age, it's a very black and white thinking. You know, if your foot's not in the right place, if your arm's not in the right place, then it's wrong. And there's correction all the time. And it depends how that correction is given. If it's not supportive, then it will really impinge on the child's self-esteem. And you have very low self-esteem, a lot of dancers do, because they're always wanting those verbal strokes. Oh, you were wonderful, darling. That was really good. And so they're always sort of wanting that, because every time in class you're corrected, which means that you're wrong. But some people have a different psychological approach and are more positive about the way. I like corrections because I can work on that. And in fact, there was a large school that I did the workshop for recently, and I asked the different year groups about corrections. You know, can they take corrections? They all take corrections. They all have their books and they write them down. I say, what happens if you don't get a correction? And there was silence. And I said, oh, come on, tell me. And they said, a lot of them said they don't like the idea of not being corrected. They feel left out. They feel ignored. I said, well, perhaps you could just reframe that and think, if you're not being corrected, aren't you doing it well? And then their faces sort of slowly lit up. Oh, yeah, it's another way of looking at it, you see.
Yeah. I
So it is that sort of support of the teachers that's needed in that aspect. So let me just now go on to the parents bit.
Yes.
The ballet moms, as you call them out there, ballet moms. You know, a lot of them, and I'm generalizing here. I'm not saying everyone's like this, but a lot of them would be that they have done ballet and they haven't gone as far as they'd wished. This is the mother or the father. And so they're pushing their child to do better than they did in their own career development, and actually, you know, to become a professional dancer. And there's a lot of students out there, and I've seen some of them and I've heard about others that are only doing it for their parents or their grandparents that are funding them. They don't actually want to do it. They are talented, but they've lost that spark that I was talking about earlier. They've lost that spark within them. They don't want to do it, but they have to carry on because they feel obliged to. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's yes, very interesting. Um, Now, in terms of, for example, when child is getting corrected and then there's a corrections becomes too much, they actually cannot take it too, where they go, well, now as a teacher, do you think I'm so bad that you give me so much corrections? Which is, I would say, if somebody's giving you corrections, they see a future in you. They see, progress, that you're going to be doing much better. And most of the time, kids usually get very offended, or parents, when there's a grading start happening. So, for example, if I say from 1 to 10, you did 3 or 4, there's that whole drama, psychological pressure and depression start happening. Where that's coming from? Like, what's your thought on that?
Okay, so what age are you talking about for your school?
Let's say the age from 10 to 14.
Okay, so it's for them, what's happened before then? So how were they treated at ordinary academic school? How have their parents treated them? And all of those aspects needed to be added to the equation of what's happening in the here and now. If they can't take correction, what has happened? What's the trigger? And that's what I was saying about me as a psychotherapist, is what I would look at. So yes, you've got here and now symptoms, but what is it that's triggering it? So there may be something going on at home at that very time. Parents divorcing, parents separated. They just can't take it anymore. And that's the. Do you know the expression, the straw breaks the camel's back?
Yes, I've heard about it.
Okay, so your correction to that child may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. In other words, a child just goes into tears, probably nothing to do with your correction or correcting them, but something else is going on, and the emotions were just at the surface there, and that just broke it. Normally, they could probably take it and they would understand what the correction's all about. And then because they've got, as you say, they've got the parents behind them pushing, pushing, pushing. So they've got the parents' voice in their heads saying, you've got to do better. You've got to do what Arson or whatever you're called. I don't know. Mr. Arson.
Oh, fine.
Yes. Professor. Professore. So they're telling that you have to listen. And so something may have happened earlier in the day, in the month, in the week, or whatever, that has just cracked it for them, and they just burst into tears.
Now, what would you give advice to the professional as well as to the kids when they get injured? It's from my own experience, when there was an injury, it feels like everything would just stop, like the whole world will stop. What would be advice, like how should either professional or child cope with that? What should they do?
Okay, so from the point of view of the injury itself, do we assume that they're being treated by a physical therapist who has great knowledge of a dancer? That will be the first assumption. Because then that physical therapist will give them remedial exercises, etc. So it'll keep their mind going and the progress. If they're just sitting around doing nothing, then that's not a good idea. And the second thing is to start journaling the thoughts, whether positive or negative. And I advocate that for anyone that's going through any issues, whether it's injury or otherwise, is to journal. Mindfulness meditation is also a really good idea because that helps you to still your mind and just be in the moment, not worrying about the past, the injury, not worrying about the future, recovery. Because for a professional dancer and for a vocational student, so going up to the late teens, it's an identity because most of them have danced from the age of 5. So that's more than 10 years, getting on for sometimes 20 years if we're talking about professional dancers, as their identity. So a loss of identity because of an injury creates even more anxiety, and then following on, there's depression from that. So they need to look at themselves. Are they still okay to carry on? Is this injury going to take them further in dance, or is this injury going to take them out of dance? So this is where therapy can also come in to play to help them see things differently and to work it out for themselves. Because a lot of the time they will talk to their parents, they'll talk to their partners, they'll talk to whoever, and they're going to get advice. Whereas when they talk with the therapist, as long as the therapist is okay, there's no advice given. So they will work it out for themselves during the therapy sessions as to a way of thinking out, because they're carrying all their baggage as well, not just the injury, the here and now injury. They're carrying all the baggage of all of the other things in the past that have happened. And so it snowballs as well, in exactly the same way as the correction I was just talking about, being corrected. It snowballs. So identity is an important part for dancers because they've started from an early age. And trying to understand how to deal with the identity is one of the first things. So keep the mind active, use distractions, use mindfulness as a way of helping them through it. And for teachers, ask the student whether or not they want to sit in class. Because I've had students come to me for therapy, and they said the teacher insists that I sit in class. And so for however many months it was while they were getting through their injury, they were watching all of their friends in that year group improving, whereas they weren't. So those are the sort of flexible things that teachers could do, is either to allow them to sit at the back rather than the front if they want to be in the class, or get them to do something else, but they need to do something rather than just sit around moping, because that will create the injury taking longer to heal, because the mind is working negatively, and the mind needs to be positive all the time to allow the body to start healing. If you become very negative and very down, the body is then looking after what's happening in the mind and not looking after the injury. So it takes injury a lot longer to heal.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, you're making like really nice, great points.
Okay.
This one is actually came as a question, and we often hear that various cultures in society view ballet as a feminine and not suitable for a man, which we know it's not true. Given extremely muscular and characteristics and requirements of the male ballet dancer, we still see the much smaller population of male dancer and than female dancers. What do you think that small population of boys still choose to become ballet dancer despite the stigma and judgment that goes along with this choice?
I think I'll go back to what I was saying. You understand that spark, as a boy going into ballet, into dance. And I think nowadays dance is very general as well, because it's hip hop, street dancing, all of that is really coming up. And so therefore boys will start dancing. They then may get interested. Yes, they're going to start at a later age, 10 plus rather than at 5 or 6 years old. But there's still an interest there. Once they get into movement and music and they see how it all works together, even in classical ballet, then there's an interest there. It's only their peers that are frightened of showing their feminine side. And I'm not saying being effeminate, but showing their feminine side. In other words, the fluidity of the arms and the hands and the body. There is still so much strength behind that. You see people, whether in football, soccer, football, or American football, or any other sports, or running, they'll do their bit, they'll do their run and their jump and what have you, and then they show they're all panting. You can't do that on stage. You have to hold it. You have to present yourself after doing an incredibly tiring solo or a pas de deux or whatever. You still have to present yourself as that was easy. So that takes real inner strength. And I think when people see that, and boys see that, thinking, my God, they're throwing that girl up around and they're doing these big jumps and leaps across the stage and etc. Yeah, I think I'd like to try that. So there is that way, but I think it's the effeminacy that people see. And I use that word advisedly because that's what the outside world sees, the effeminacy of the man, where in fact it's not effeminacy at all. It's control and strength.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, how do you see cultural ballet training and dancers? Let's say, well, I'm coming more from Russia, which is there. It's a culture, it's a tradition. Male is the male. There was no understanding of feminine dancer. And in United States, you've probably done a lot of workshops here where you kind of getting different feedbacks from parents, teachers, and kids. And in UK, do you feel the difference of psychology there between countries or styles even?
Yeah, it's the styles. So the American style, the European style, that includes the British style as well, are easier going. Although there's still the black and white thinking, if you're not doing it right, you're wrong. But the Russian style, in general terms, whether it's Russian, Vaganova, or whatever, that Russian style is very hard on the students. So the style itself is rigorous, and I'm thinking of the Vaganova school now,
Mhm.
that they all have to be the same height, they all have to have the same shape, etc. So a lot of the dancers will fall by the wayside quite early, and the stringent, rigorous training, you will find a lot of them. I can't remember what percentage, but it's something like 85% of the students were working through injuries. So they will persevere through injuries rather than going off and working through. And this was the way, and the Chinese as well, by the way, do exactly the same. And you were trained in Russia, weren't you?
Yes, yes,
Yes. So do you recognize what I'm saying?
absolutely.
Yes.
100.
So yes. So working through injuries, working through um, mental aberrations that are going on in the head because of the pressure, is really not very good. And the longevity of a career is cut short because of that. So, but the American way, the European way, and the British way um, are now changing in the past 10 years or so. But as I told you earlier, I'm still knocking on doors and people are ignoring me. So they still won't talk about the mental health. But the bigger schools now have got these physical therapists that are trained just for dancers. And so they do have, you need to go off sick now. You need to rest, not work through that. And you start back in class when you're told to, which is wonderful.
But how do you accomplish that quality, that the beauty of it? If you don't have that discipline. I mean, if you look, I kind of always seen, I don't know, ballet beautiful, but in the same time it was army, and the only that type of discipline you could get that quality and become world type of dancer, like sorry, every Russian dancer became in the past.
Mm. I agree with you from a performance point of view, but not from a human point of view. So they become robotic. So your head must be at a 40-degree angle, and you're looking at the tips of your fingers, which must be at such an angle from there, and it becomes very robotic. So from an audience point of view, they all look the same. Isn't that wonderful? All those 40 swans that look identical, which means that they're not unique. There's no unique personality. I was giving a talk in Birmingham last year. That's not Alabama, in Birmingham, UK. And there was a Chinese young lady in the group that I was talking with, and I was talking about their uniqueness and how we should all recognize that we are all different. You might have six dancers standing in a row, and they're near enough the same size, but their shape is different, their background is different, they are unique. And the poor girl burst into tears, and one of the helpers took her out, and she was sobbing uncontrollably. The helper came back after the talk and said, "Thank you very much." I thought, "What? Thank you for making her cry?" She said, "No, thank you very much." The girl then came back and said she was at the Beijing Academy until 3 years ago, and because they all had to be identical, she was rejected, having been there for another 3 years, I think, before that. And she said, "You said that I am unique." And that's what made her cry. She said, "I haven't danced for 3 years. I'm now going to go back to do class again." She was learning how to be a teacher. And so that was good, that there's a realization. And I think that the Russian style, I'm going to be really, you're going to get so many emails about this. I think the Russian style, the Chinese style, is very much robotic and not individualistic. It doesn't bring the individual out. Only the person who really stands out will become famous. And then what happens? They all come to the UK and go to America, so that they can become famous there.
Yeah.
There needs to be a different way of thinking, and not so robotic. They can still be beautiful dancers, but to be gentle and not so fierce with the training and so restrictive. There's a book called Mao's Last Dancer.
Yes. And the
Um,
movie came out too.
yeah, and he's now in not Brisbane. Yes, Brisbane.
Mhm.
He runs the Queensland Ballet Company. But it was horrendous what they did there to him. And I think it probably still goes on, but who knows? But I think there needs to be a different psychological approach to look at the wholeness of the dancer, both physical, emotional, and spiritual.
Every company has like the union rules, which is one control, and then a nonprofit organization board of directors really telling what to do and how to run things without knowledge of it.
But hopefully, you see, and you say that they have no knowledge, but hopefully, those board of directors or the board of trustees, if it's a non-profit, then they bring in people from different fields, don't they? So from marketing, from advertising, from someone that knows about charities, who don't necessarily know about ballet itself or dance, but know in their own field. So what you're saying is those people are putting propositions and votes and backing someone,
Mm.
an artistic director perhaps, who doesn't know anything about it. But is that what you're talking about?
Well, kind of, yes.
It's difficult to know what to do about that because obviously we've had stories recently in the last couple of years of artistic directors who have been dancers and have choreographed, etc., and are now accused of physical and emotional abuse and sexual abuse as well.
Mm.
The power behind that creates all these underlying factors that have probably been with them all their life, and probably when they were dancing, they were doing it then, but wasn't looked on in the same way as it is now. It was sort of brushed aside. Oh, he's a principal, so we'll just brush it aside. He's all right. He's good at dancing.
Well, which
And it's the same thing with artistic directors. Oh well, brought all this money in. He's brought all these wonderful dancers. Yeah, but what is he doing to the dancers? In exactly the same way as the Russian style of training is doing to the students.
well, which is kind of the point is, if you're a great dancer, you're a star of some of the company bullshit. It doesn't mean you're a great teacher. I mean,
Correct.
you know,
That's correct.
so it's like
Yeah.
so much more to become. I personally, when I teach, I rather like really to dance because it takes so much energy, physical, psychological, everything. It just kids sometimes will drain all of you, and you're like, oh my god, I just taught for 2 hours, and you feel like you
Mm.
8 hours.
Okay. Well, after this interview, I'll give you some mind work to do to
There
help
you
you.
go, great. Well, Terry,
Yes, no, you are so right, Arson, that a good dancer isn't necessarily a good teacher because it's trying to convey something to a student, what they need to do and how they need to do it.
yeah.
And it's not necessarily so with a good dancer.
Like, I mean, great. I see a lot. Sometimes a great dancer comes and does a summer program, and then they're standing and then kicking the leg, do 8 pirouettes and all that stuff. This is how you do it, and the kid's just standing and like, well, our body's never done that, so how do?
Mm.
And then sometimes I feel dancers who really experience difficulty in training or started in the older. They went through really difficult process that could explain much better to the kids because of the things that they went through, what they did. Let's say what they did when they didn't have a turnout, or what they did when they didn't have a good jump. So the process of developing a child or wants to become a dancer, it's better from not a big star, I would say.
Yes, yeah, because there are some fantastic teachers around that didn't make it to stardom,
Yeah,
but they've picked up different things. You see, a lot of the stars rush through that corps de ballet stage.
yeah,
They've not worked in the corps de ballet. They've not necessarily worked as junior soloists. They went possibly straight up to the top. And going through that process, they knew they were good, and they knew everything that they needed to know. They didn't go through a slower process,
yeah.
um, which which most of us went through. And so therefore, I mean, I taught and choreographed a bit after retiring from performing. And I couldn't teach tiny little ones. I had to teach ones who were second or third year before leaving vocational schools, ones that actually knew what I was talking about. And I don't know whether you find that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just like the mind. I find the kids when they're age 5 to 11, they don't see their bodies when they look at the mirror. They just look at their face. And then what happens in the age of 11, 12, they slowly start looking at their body and understanding what their legs and arms are doing. So it's very interesting. And then as they're developing, some kids I have that I taught them now they're 18 or 21, they're like, oh, Arson, now I understand what you were saying, which is they would look at it and then now I understand why you were keep telling me about that arm, that they could not see it as they were developing in younger age. So
Mm,
it's a very interesting process. Very interesting.
yes, yeah,
But Terry, thank you so much for connecting with me and talking
my pleasure.
on TV. I really appreciate that. Any advice you probably would give to the dancers right now, just who is like transitioning in the career, who has an injury, or who is trying to get into the company or competition? What would be your just kind of like short advice that they should stick to?
That was about 10 things you've asked me there.
Oh,
You want one bit of advice?
well,
Um, General advice is to reframe anything that you feel is negative. So if you're feeling down about something, what can you learn from it? So what positive thing can you take away from it? Yes, you may have not got the job. They may have rejected you at audition. But what have you learned about it? What did you learn from that? The other thing is if you are transitioning, is to be positive about a transition. It's not a failure. It's a moving on from what you're doing. And because I spoke earlier about the identity, so you have to deal with the identity. Every transition in our life, whether it's from first school to middle school to college, they're all transitions. Each one needs a grieving process because you've left behind something, whether it's friends, whether it's a home, you've had to move around the country or abroad or wherever. It's all a grieving process. Every transition in our life, and we go through loads of them, if you're supported in the early transitions, the early grieving, then you will be strong enough internally to deal with each transition that you've got to. If you haven't watched people who've transitioned and have grieved, or whether the transition is losing a grandparent or something like that, that's a proper grieving. If you've been told, look, that person's dead, get on with your life, then you haven't dealt with that transition. You haven't mourned for that person. You haven't grieved. So, or a pet. So all of these things in life need to move on, but you need to deal with the grieving process each time. So that's your answer to transitions.
wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'll provide the all information of contact and your email so that people can access and book the workshops with you. I think they will be very
Okay.
absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. No, thank you.